If you could stand in the middle of Kansas 100 million years ago, you wouldn't see cornfields or highways or weathered fence posts. You would bob on warm salt water under a wide, blinding sky. This was the Western Interior Seaway, an inland ocean that split North America from the Arctic to the Gulf, turning the continent's belly into blue. High global sea levels and the slow bowing of the crust under mountain building let the ocean flood the lowlands, and for millions of years currents stitched together tropical shallows and temperate bays. As a science communicator and paleontologist, I love taking students to chalk bluffs, where this sea left pages of history you can touch. Every crumb of that chalk is the microscopic plate of a plankton that once floated in sunlit water. Hold a piece and you are holding the quiet snow of ancient summers, piled into cliffs where hawks now ride the wind. But the water itself was anything but quiet. It carried hunters shaped by evolution into perfect tools. Mosasaurs with double-hinged jaws and tail fins like scimitars. Long-necked plesiosaurs that rode through the glare like living question marks. Sharks with knives for teeth and senses tuned to the faintest heartbeat. Trinodons trace lazy parabolas above rip lines where fish schooled, and on certain evenings a diving bird named Hesperornis knifed through green light, wings reduced to steadying paddles, feet beating a rhythm older than cities. Below the glare, ammonites spiraled like nautilus lanterns, and slabs of inoceramid clams paved the bottom in plates as big as coffee tables. This was a sea with neighborhoods, clear, warm shallows where sunlight woke storms of algae. Deeper basins where oxygen ran thin and the bottom kept secrets in velvet darkness. Coastal deltas where rivers bled fresh water and mud into swirls that smelled of life. Imagine a body of water wider than some countries, yet shallow enough in places that sunlight painted the sand, and deep enough in others to hide leviathans. I remember a rancher named Leela calling our museum after a summer storm chewed a gully into her pasture. "Sheep keep tripping on a rock with teeth," she said, and we knew Kansas was about to speak again. We hiked out with packs, GPS, plaster, and hope, the August heat buzzing like a giant power line, and there in the cut bank the sea had blinked open, vertebrae stacked like coins, each the color of baked bread, and a jaw arc-laced with serrations sharp enough to whisper through denim. We brushed sand the way you brush sleep from your eyes and felt that familiar shift when bones stop being objects and start being stories. Under Leela's cotton woods, we taught a local 4-H group how to jacket a fossil, how to read the tilt of bones, how to anchor a note card with a pebble so the wine doesn't run away with your data. The kids laughed when plaster dripped onto their boots, and then fell silent when the outline of a skull emerged, the snout blunt, the teeth rooted deep, the palate armed with backward-pointing spikes to hold struggling prey. Mosasaurs were not dinosaurs, I said gently, but ocean-going lizards, cousins of the ones that flick tongues in your garden, scaled up and rewritten by the sea. In the lab weeks later, the skull gave us its name in the sweep of bone in front of the eye and the shape of the tail vertebrae, a Tylosaurus, a torpedo with ribs. What makes finds like Leela's so moving, in only the jaw-dropping size? It's the way each fossil lets us time travel into a particular afternoon. You can almost feel the water temperature, taste the salt, sense the instant an animal turned to late. Science is not just data, it is empathy sharpened by evidence. In this seaway the rules were simple and unforgiving: move efficiently, eat often, and don't blink when the shadow widens above you. Creatures obeyed these rules with bodies that told their biographies. Elasmosaurus wore a neck of many vertebrae, a living fishing line that let the head sweep without turning the body, sneaking up like a periscope through curtains of baitfish. Cretoxyrhina, the so-called Ginsu shark, had teeth shaped for slicing and a body meant for speed, and its bite marks tattooed bones the way storms carve coastlines. Xiphactinus, a bony fish the length of a pickup truck, sometimes died with a smaller fish inside it, the tragedy of overconfidence preserved like a punch line in limestone. When I share this with audiences, I watch the surprise land, and then the recognition. We also live by rules we don't write, in ecosystems we only partly see, and our choices leave marks on the world that someone, someday, will read. The Western Interior Seaway isn't a myth. It's the earlier version of the neighborhood you know, and its best lesson is humility mixed with awe, as we wade into its story together. Keep that piece of chalk in mind. It is proof that even the quietest creatures can build worlds, and that time can turn whispers into cliffs. Hear it crunch. When people ask what it felt like to swim in that sea, I tell them about the physics of fear and grace that governed every move. Picture a Tylosaurus rising from dim water like a missile, tail beating in a smooth S as the spine stores and releases energy. A lunge is not muscle alone, it is math in motion. The skull, a battering ram with teeth, the snout good for stunning prey, the jaw joints allowing a mouth wide enough to swallow a folding chair. Yet even a tyrant must listen, and the seaway spoke in cues, a pressure wave from a fleeing fish, the metallic twitch of a school turning, the flash of a fin at the limit of sight. Not every hunter was colossal. Squalocorax, a crow shark as long as a pickup, cruised the margins like a highway scavenger, leaving scalloped bite marks on turtle shells and mosasaur bones alike. Its gift was timing. Elasmosaurus hovered like a patient question that had a small, clever answer at the end of a graceful problem, the neck weaving through light splinters where baitfish huddled into glittering thoughts. Science reads these scenes from traces, and each trace adds a voice to the chorus. One summer our crew mapped a bonebed where turtle shells and fish ribs formed a loose braid across a slope of creamy chalk. My grad student Avery was on her first big expedition, carrying ordinary worries you might know well, paying rent, calling home enough, wondering if she belonged. By the third day, the wind had sandblasted our cheeks. Our water jugs were warm as tea, and Avery's field notebook flapped like a gull. We slowed down, not from defeat, but from respect. Good science knows when to sprint and when to kneel. Kneeling revealed a pattern. Parallel tooth marks on several ribs, aligned as if laid by the same hand. Avery traced them with a brush and smiled without looking up. Squalocorax, she said, quietly claiming fluency in a language that had felt foreign. That evening she sketched the bite pattern in camp by lantern light while thunderheads massed over the Flint Hills. The page looked like a lesson written by the sea to a willing student. Another day, we opened a jacket in the lab and found a Xiphactinus with a fish inside it from snout to tail, the inner fish's spine arched in a permanent shudder. Our volunteer Diego, a wildlife artist between commissions and confidence, stared for a long time and then began to draw in charcoal, letting light grow from darkness until the scene read like a parable about appetite and restraint. His portfolio had stalled. Here, the fossils gave him momentum. He learned that accuracy is not the enemy of wonder, it is wonder given a backbone. When Diego later painted a mural for the county library, kids stood in front of a wall where Pteranodon wheeled and Hesperornis kicked at silver bubbles, and I watched him teach with his hands as much as with his words. He pointed out the angle of a Mosasaur's tail fin, the counter-shaded belly, the way a Plesiosaur's flippers skull rather than flap. He spoke softly, and the room leaned closer. Meanwhile, the rocks whispered other lessons about time itself. Bands of darker shale mark intervals when oxygen vanished from deeper water and organic-rich mud settled like a held breath. In these layers, shells are fewer, fish are scarce, and the story pauses. Then chalk returns, bright as a page turned, and life surges again. The seaway did not stand still. Shorelines wandered, channels opened and closed, and creatures tracked opportunity the way migrating birds track a front. Paleogeographic maps let us follow these shifts like weather forecasts drawn for centuries at a time. To the east, sediments fanned into deltas. In between, plankton bloomed and died, until entire formations became soft white stone. The Niobrara and Pierre formations are not just names on a map. They are libraries, and each fossil is a book you check out by patience. We haul plaster, shovel spoil, tape blisters, and log coordinates under skies that refuse mercy, because the moment a fossil surface appears, the whole landscape changes. On a good day, you feel the planet turn, And on a hard one, you learn that the work still matters. Avery had one of those days when a sudden squall snapped our shade tent and scattered sample bags. She stood in the high grit and kept to the simple rhythm: find, note, cover, breathe. Later she told me she had come to the Seaway to collect credits and left with a compass. That is what this ocean still offers: orientation, through deep time, to living now. Predators and prey sharpened each other into brilliance, and in their wake the sea wrote equations in bone about energy, risk, and recovery that apply just as neatly to budgets, friendships, and creative work. If a mosasaur trusts the curve of its tail, you can trust the curve of your learning. If a crow shark survives by timing, you can plan your own strikes with care. If a fish overreaches, you can remember that hunger without wisdom carries its own fossils. Choose well. As the Cretaceous wore on, the Western Interior Seaway changed the way all living seas do, quietly at first, then all at once. Tectonic forces hoisted the land in slow motion while global sea level wavered, and the corridor narrowed. Coastlines retreated, estuaries pinched into bays, and places that had known waves for millions of years learned dust again. If you could time-lapse the last 10 million years of the Seaway, you would watch a blue ribbon fray and pull back, leaving behind broad floodplains where the ghosts of tides still pattern the mud. In the final act, by the very end of the Cretaceous, the great interior ocean had become a patchwork of shallow embayments, and the stage was set for a catastrophe that would reset the script. 66 million years ago, an asteroid struck near the Yucatan, and the world flinched so hard that even this inland region felt the shock. Dust and sulfur darkened the sky, photosynthesis stalled, food webs buckled, and in oceans everywhere the big air breathers and many of the shell drifters vanished. Mosasaurs and Plesiosaurs did not see a new dawn. Ammonites spiraled to close, and sharks, resilient and opportunistic, swam on into the Paleogene with new rosters. On land, birds that could eat seeds and hide survived, and over deep time their lineages would fill forests and shorelines again, some of them returning to the water as loons and cormorants that echo Hesperornis in spirit if not in bone. When I tell this part in classrooms, someone always asks whether the Seaway ended because of the impact. We talk about timing, how uplift and falling seas were already draining the basin, how the impact was a door that slammed while the room was already emptying. History is rarely a single hammer blow, it is a series of turns, and then a hinge. Deep time helps us hold more than one truth at once, and that's a skill worth practicing far outside geology. Today the chalk and shale remember. Prairies roll over them like a green tide in summer, and cattle drink from stock ponds blue as little pieces of that vanished sea. On the walls of a small museum in Hayes, a long jaw of Tylosaurus hangs with a quiet authority that no velvet rope can soften, and a school group gathers. The community storyteller, Mrs. Patel from the library, sets down a tote of picture books and nods for me to begin. We make a good duet. I talk about buoyancy and bone. She talks about courage and curiosity, and we both talk about listening. You can watch the lesson travel from fossil to face like light across water. Afterward, a boy named Moloch stays behind. He carries a notebook with more drawings than words and says he doesn't love science because it is hard, but he loves drawing sharks because they look like motion. I tell him the sea needs both, people who measure and people who see. And the best days are when one person tries to do both. We walk to the prep lab, a room that smells faintly of dust and patience, where a technician leans into a microscope and guides a pinprick of air across chalk to free a fragile rib. The compressor chatters, the rib brightens, and Moloch leans so close that his breath fogs the glass. He draws what he sees, which is what science always begins with. The Seaway teaches economy, waste little, cycle everything, match form to function, and dance with change. It also teaches caution. When oceans warm and acidify quickly, the smallest builders suffer, and the record shows how fast collapse can travel up a food web. We are not spectators. We are a species with oars in the water, able to steer, and the fossils are a weathered chart reminding us where the shoals lie. If the Western Interior Seaway feels impossibly distant, remember that its edges are in your pantry and your commute and your town budget. Limestone in your walls, fuel from ancient plankton, roads that follow old shorelines. Knowing this connects responsibility to wonder. It is hard to harm what you have learned to love and easy to ignore what you never knew. So, we keep telling the story, not to scold but to invite. Leela still checks the pasture after storms. Avery now manners a new field crew. Diego's library mural gathers fresh fingerprints each week, and Mrs. Patel updates the reading list to include voices who were seldom heard when the first fossils were named. Our chorus grows, and the inland sea, though gone, keeps working. In the way a child hears the word mosasaur and smiles. In the way a wind farm maps the memory of a sky full of wings. In the way a museum label turns a glass case into a conversation. Stand again in Kansas with me and picture it. The sun is high, the water warm, and somewhere beneath you a shadow lengthens. You think of speed and restraint and the turn of the planet. You inhale salt that is now prairie wind, and as you let it go you keep a promise to notice, to learn, and to pass the story forward, because stories are the boats that carry us across deep time and back home. Keep listening.